Pseudo-Historical Society. Today's lecture begins with a focus on Henry Williamson. We will begin with the mysterious symbols in his journal and their relation to the world at large, analyzing said symbols with the latest in numerological historiography, the meaning of which I'll get to in just a little bit. And with me today is my colleague Will Foster, a treasurer of the North American Pseudo-Historical Society and research assistant to Professor Harold Oates. As with the first lecture in the series, to preserve the narrative flow of today's presentation, I will refrain from citing the source of every fact after every fact. Also, due to the somewhat shadowy nature of the order in its records, what we know has been drawn from several sources with varying degrees of reliability, including public record, personal journal, historical websites, and pure conjecture. Alright, so we left off last lecture with Mr. Henry Williamson, who we see here, receiving a collection of P.T. Cimendinger, the subject of last 2 weeks ago's lecture, receiving a collection of P.T. Cimendinger's personal writings. And after this event, Mr. Williamson went on to have an interesting and exciting life as written about in his journal. So here we see a young Henry Williamson. This is actually one of the very few pictures we have of him. And he's much younger here than he was at the time that most of this took place. Like P.T. Cimendinger, Williamson too found himself on a quest towards an unknown goal, a quest that, like Cimendinger, would come to torment Henry, leading him further into madness and eventually to his presumed death at sea, somewhere off the coast of Earth, which would be, so here's Australia, and Earth is on the edge, and the last known sighting or whereabouts of Henry Williamson are around here. And this is an illustration of the ship, not unlike the one that Henry Williamson probably. Alright, so Williamson's journal, mostly written in the form of a long letter to his wife Margaret, is filled with a wealth of fabulous symbols, metaphysics, and most puzzling and controversial, mysterious, unknown symbols. Unfortunately, due to the harsh conditions at sea and the very strict preservation techniques used to save what is left of the journal, what we have is very fragile and available to only a select few with special clearance. I was actually only able to get even this much of the journal available to me because of my connection with Mr. Foster here and his connection with Mr. Harold Oates. And I want you guys to I know the images aren't great, but if you could pay attention to to this symbol right here, which you see, it's kind of like a diamond with something in the middle and stuff on the edges. That's going to become important later on in this lecture. And here it is again. Alright, so I mentioned at the beginning that we were going to be looking at some numerological historiography. Is anybody familiar with the technique? Good. Okay, then it won't be redundant. So numerological historiography is the standardized application of numerological techniques to figures or events of historical import to discern their motives and what, if any, might be the deeper meaning of their occurrence. So that's like the kind of standard dictionary definition. I'm going to unpack that a little bit. So although loosely connected to traditional numerology, numerological historiography differs in two kind of key ways. The first and most important is its use. Numerology is most commonly used as a form of divination, kind of an attempt to discern the future. Numerological historiography, however, looks backwards rather than forward, seeking to find cause and meaning rather than prophecy and portents. And a fitting analogy here would be the way in which social studies differs from astrology. So kind of to illustrate that point, over on our left here I have a famous painting of the Oracle at Delphi, kind of a famous fortune-telling symbol. And to the right I have an illustration of the Muse of History. The second way in which numerological historiography differs from traditional numerology is in its complexity. So there are as many different forms of numerology, kind of the fortune-telling kind, as there are cultures throughout history. However, within each system, numbers tend to hold a fixed meaning. Two examples here are the ancient Hebrew gematria, or the more popular Kabbalah, which I have illustrated on our left and right, where each number has a really complicated meaning, but the meaning of the number never changes. In numerological historiography, however, the meaning behind the numbers themselves can be influenced by the events surrounding them, and vice versa. So the exact method by which each is determined and the shape in which the numbers are then plotted is a highly technical and at times intuitive process. And so for the sake of brevity and because we have so much to cover, I'll just say this: it's very complicated. All right. So in the case of Mr. Henry Williamson's wonderful journal, the numbers are as follows, kind of the meanings of the numbers. 0 acts more as a placeholder than as any sort of significance. 1, which, anyway, there's Henry Williamson again, and then on our right are the numbers as I read them off. 1 kind of symbolizes aggression or force or just kind of raw power, and not necessarily like a power for good, but not necessarily a power for bad either. 2, it kind of symbolizes balance against all odds. 3 is kind of a tricky one. We're still working on it. There's more research needed, but we know it has something to do with communication. 4 is a really important number, 4 and 5. 4 is creation and destruction all at once. It's sort of a numerological Ouroboros. It's the only word in the English language that has the same value as the number of letters in the word, which is kind of a purity of truth thing. It's really a big deal. But it's also a homonym in a lot of different languages for the word for death. So it's kind of creation, but also destruction. It's a really weird one. 5, again, I said, is another important one. It kind of signifies action and adventure, doing something. 6 is home, family, stable life. 7 is another kind of tricky one, like 3. It's not really clear, but it's kind of consciousness or spirit. 8 is power and sacrifice, and the relationship those two things have to each other. And 9 is extreme transformation. So to the right, as I said before, those are all the numbers. And you can also see a color key that connects each number with a visual symbol of its meaning. And you guys are really in for a treat, because this is actually a new and highly experimental technique. The color and the nature of each number symbol is developed in a process that is similar but separate from determining its meaning. Though this visual illustration neither adds to nor takes away from the meaning of each histograph, it does allow for us to more easily see patterns in large passages of text. So, like I said, it's still a pretty new technique, so bear with us here. All right, so what does all that mean? It's a great question. In translation, it ends up looking like this. So here we see numerological historiographs from a few keywords and phrases from Williamson's journal. So at the top is just a phrase that appears frequently and isn't like super important. It was kind of the test run. But down here at the bottom, we see Henry Williamson's name. And we see a lot of this really strong tendency towards ones, that kind of action, force, power. But then at the same time, we see kind of balanced twos, which was balance against all odds. So it's a really weird combination. And we also see a lot of those nines, which are the total transformation. But more interesting is what we don't see, which are 6s or 7s, which were like the stable home life responsibility, which kind of makes sense because he left home in his late 30s? Yes. Mid to late 30s, and kind of never returned. And then over to our right, we see a translation of a word that appears several times in his journal. And what makes his journal super interesting was that he was around, kind of around the time of Krakatoa. Is anyone familiar with Krakatoa? Do you want to give a brief explanation of what it was?
Not what it's a volcano.
It's a volcano, yeah, right? So if you look at the translation of Krakatoa and the native Krakatau, am I saying that right? Krakatau. We see this really strong, like, force and power and kind of like aggression, and it looks not unlike a volcano. You see kind of like the mountain shape of a lava, which is really cool. And it also kind of this shape of center mass and a line going straight through it, is also not unlike the antipodes, which, here's kind of an interesting fact. Perth, the area of Perth where Henry Williamson was last seen, is the antipode to Newark, Ohio, where Philip Toland Simmendinger, remember from the last lecture, had his kind of thing. So it's kind of cool. And this was like our big, kind of the big effort here. Do I have a volunteer who would like to read the passage from Henry Williamson's journal? Yes, yes.
Did you want to get this one?
Nope, you were the only one.
The way must be taken. It is the way. Revealed in traveling, it is those who would venture beyond the shores and leave their control as driftwood on the sands.
Yeah, so that passage on its own is kind of weird and new agey, but it comes in the midst of a really normal journal about like, oh, I'm at sea and I'm having this great time and I'm really excited, and he's writing to his wife, and then all of a sudden it breaks off into this. So that kind of tells us like maybe that's really significant, or that's not his voice, or something weird. So we decided to apply the techniques, the pneumological historiography, to this passage, and the results are pretty crazy. Also, just a note: the capitalization and the grammar are exactly as they appear in the journal, and so. So we see a lot of ones, kind of like we saw with his name. Those are the red squares. We see 3, which again, that one we're not 100% sure, but it has to do something with communication, which makes sense that it's in a letter to his wife. We see a lot of 8, 9, and 5. Remember, 8 was sacrifice and power and the relationship those two things have, which Henry Williamson sacrificed a lot in his life. For a quest that even he wasn't really sure what it was about. And 5 was that action, adventure, doing, which makes sense if you go away to a life at sea and never return. There's a lot of those blue circles, which are the 4, which is the creation and the destruction. And then, even more bizarre, are all of these 2s. So there's all these kind of forces and power and like things moving and stuff happening, but it's all also kind of balanced out with balancing its odds. So, right. We're still not 100% sure what it means. It's not an exact science, but it's pretty interesting. I believe I'm going to turn the stage over to my colleague, Phil Foster.
Thank you. Hi everyone, I'm Phil Foster, and as previously mentioned, I'm the assistant to Dr. Harold Oates, and I'm going to play you right now. We had a bit of a technical difficulty back here, but I'm going to play a clip from Dr. Oates' podcast, and we'll take a minute to listen to that, and then I'll get into some of the research that he and I have been working on for the past few years.
The Pocket Watch Historian presents Minuteman Historia, Harold Oates' incredible tales of antiquity. The Pillars of Hercules. 2 columns marking the outermost limits of Hercules' travels. The place where it is said he smashed through a mountain, creating the Strait of Gibraltar. Another account claims the demigod narrowed the extant strait to prevent the monsters of the Atlantic from entering the Mediterranean. Inscribed upon these vast columns, the words non plus ultra, nothing further beyond. As far as the ancients were concerned, the Atlantic was terra incognita, a place not only unknown, but unknowable to mortals, a place known only to gods and monsters. The Pillars of Hercules came to represent the division between knowledge of mere mortals and the forbidden knowledge of the gods. Startling new evidence indicates the widespread existence of a cross-cultural order. depths of the Mediterranean, images of the Midland goddess and followers with knotted shoulder pads curving up around the head. Knots that symbolize the untold enigma of the minds of gods. They speak of a covenant, an order, a place for the powers of mankind, and a place for the hidden powers of the divine.
Stop that right there. And so that's, again, a podcast from Dr. Harold Oates. And so what you heard, start this. Okay. So to locate us, the Pillars of Hercules were believed to be in between the Mediterranean Sea, as you can see, and the Atlantic Ocean, which is sometimes referred to in ancient texts as the Sea of Darkness. And that's known today as the Straits of Gibraltar. There are some images of the Pillars of Hercules, what they're believed to have looked like, that have been found in a lot of ancient texts. And you can see the text here, non plus ultra, which was mentioned in that segment of the podcast that we listened to. And so the first thing that I want to talk about is, was mentioned in here, which is the connection between these knots, which you can see here, which are a new discovery found from Minoan civilization. Excuse me. And they are, you can see them here too. Some historians have believed them to be simply shoulder pads, but through some of the research that Dr. Oates and I have been doing, we've discovered that these are in fact not simply shoulder pads for the sake of decoration, but they're more knotted. You can see here some of the symbols that the Mayans used for knotting are here, and they some of that symbology is concurrent with what we saw back here on the columns. The columns were a symbol for a division between regions where mortals were supposed to inhabit, and not only regions of like physical regions, but as we saw, the Mediterranean Sea was considered in ancient times a more tame sea than the Atlantic Ocean, which was considered off limits to a lot of the smaller vessels that would have been around in ancient times. And you can see that. You can see that the shoulder pads here rise up around the goddess, which is very important to rise around the head, the head is traditionally symbolized knowledge. And these sort of mimic sort of the idea of columns blocking off and securing what might be called her headspace, or a divine knowledge that is separated and kept distant from the knowledge of the mortals. Another interesting connection comes when we look at sort of the etymology of the words for knot. If you look in the 1001 Nights, which is also known as the Arabian Nights, there's a tale of a fisherman and a jinni. Now, jinn is the Arabic word for what we would call genie in English, and that's an anglicized version of that. The root of that word is jinn, which means of several different things, and it is related to the words for both knot and for madness. But it's used in a lot of contexts to define things that are occult, or things that remain hidden, especially in relationship to the mind. And so, as you can imagine, to a mortal, like a mortal fisherman who has opened this container containing this genie, that the mind of a genie, someone who has powers far beyond what a mere mortal could comprehend, is simply inconceivable. Moving on. This motif of a hidden nature, of a hidden mind that is separate from a mortal mind is also found. Oh, I forgot something. I wanted to show you what Jin looks like in. I think I'm done here. I'll move this way forward. Sorry. Markers are in short supply. So roughly, alright, so this is Jin, which is spelled so. And fascinatingly enough, in Arabic, you'll notice a lot of Arabic is calligraphic, and the reason that a lot of that the language evolved that way is because there was a suspicion in the ancient Arab world, excuse me, that figurative art was seen as idolatrous, and so there was a movement to work like this symbolically. And you can see. I don't have an example for you today, but a lot of other Arabic calligraphy is very ornate and almost pictorial in its illustration. But what we can see is that there is an interesting connection that happens between the Arabic language, which is an Arabic calligraphic tradition, and the world of Western symbology. So, looking at something like an ancient image of Oedipus and the Sphinx, we can see that some of the forms that the figures take in this, and some of the symbols are both relevant to the definition of a lot of calligraphic works. So I'm going to give you a little demonstration here. You can see this is a more primitive form of the word jinn, but if you look over on the whiteboard, you can see very similar forms here, that there's a sort of eye-shaped sweep followed by a columnar figure, and then we also have these two forms here, these dots, which in many forms of calligraphy throughout the ancient Arabic world have been used to symbolize different kinds of thought, or if there's a connection to thought, often it's used with this punctuation. So you can see here that there's a division, and as we know from the story of Oedipus, the Sphinx is a guardian of secret truths and uses riddles to question Oedipus. And so you can see the mind of Oedipus represented here by his contemplative figure. And then that's separated from the mind of the Sphinx, which is guarding sacred truth or some kind of hidden knowledge. There's another example here from a similar pose, but this one has been reversed. This is an oracle. I believe it. Let me see. It's the oracle, the Pythian oracle, and you can see here that some of the similar shapes are in use here. You have a division between the mere mortal and what would you consider a gatekeeper between the knowledge of the mortal and the knowledge of the divine. And this empty space here is another, a very common thing to see in a lot of these symbolic illustrations, where to the mortal eye, it is supposed to appear as a sort of negative space, or a space that is unoccupied by our eyes. And we are represented in this as the typical Pythian coming to seek the help of the oracle. And so this represents what is hidden and held behind by the gatekeeper of the oracle, who has knowledge of the gods. Okay, so we're all familiar with the story of the Gordian knot. At one time, the people of Phrygia were without a king, and the oracle at, I'm not sure how to pronounce this, let's see, Telmissus, I believe it is, which is the capital of ancient Phrygia, had prophesied that the next man who drove into the city on an ox cart would be instantly crowned the king of Phrygia, of all Phrygia. And Phrygia, for those of you that don't know, is a region that's near Upper Greece and Macedonia, but it's changed hands many times throughout the course of history. Now, the story goes that Gordius, which is where the Gordian knot gets its name from, was simply a peasant farmer, and he drove his cart into the city, and while he was driving it in, an eagle landed on the cart, and he took it as a sign from. They didn't call it Zeus in ancient Phrygia. They called it. Let's see, what is it called? It's. Sabazios, who was basically the Phrygian equivalent of Zeus. Now, there's a couple different ways that the Gordian knot is portrayed. It's either that in honor of becoming king, when Gordius became king, his son basically took the cart as a family heirloom or as a symbol of a covenant between gods and men. The Zeus deity had blessed Gordius with this kingdom, and as a sign of the unbreakable oath between gods and men, he had it tied either to a post. Some historians argue, or there's some debate as to whether it was actually a knot that tied the wheel to the shaft, making it so the wheels couldn't be turned and the cart taken away. So we know the story of Alexander breaking the knot, and there's a lot of debate among historians about the translation of the Greek here, because in some accounts, Alexander is said to have cut the knot with a sword, right? And that's how he solved this problem, was through military might, and that it was prophesied that through his military might and the symbol of cutting this complex problem that he could have tried to untie, he took his military might and smashed through it, and that was to become a symbol for his conquest of most of the known Western world at that time. But there's some interesting spellings here, and there's some debate about what the Greek actually translates to, because the Greek word for untie is the exact same word for the Greek word to destroy. So, where some historians have interpreted it as destroy, as chop through the Gordian knot, some historians have opted to choose that he somehow figured a way that he untied this knot. Now, when he said that, or when he destroyed the knot, either way, he said something very interesting. I'm trying to make this very quick. I'm going to write this up here really fast for Will. Yeah, that's. And so there is some debate among historians about whether he spelled this as such or like this. Now, I'm afraid I'm going to have to stop there. I do have a little bit more, but if you are interested in learning a little bit more, if I had more time, I would go into, there's a couple things that I should just mention, is that some of the connections between these different translations and some of the symbols that we've explored today suggest that there might have been a greater connection between the ancient worlds than we previously suspected, because one of the beliefs that we've discovered is that that the Gordian knot may have in fact not have been a knot as we're used to it, but it could have been a growing plant that was grown in a knot formation like around the pole or around the shaft of the ox cart, and that this would suggest that due to the type of plant that it was, that there's a very strong possibility that there were connections between ancient Greece and the West African coast, and that some of the cults that derive from the symbology that we've talked about this evening are still extant and in the New World, and that they were translated from the Old World to the New World via Western African traditions. And you can find out more about that by listening to Dr. Oates' podcast. Sorry to truncate that.
Just for the sake of time, because we do only have the room until 6:15, I just wanted to pause and see if there are any questions. Anything interesting? Yes.
I was wondering, going back to your point, or your piece about the numerological historiography, am I saying that correctly? Yeah.
Yes.
And using that device to sort of map names, I was wondering if you or any of your colleagues have mapped your names in order to determine sort of your role in this saga.
I haven't, and the reason why I haven't is because part of the ways that numerological historiography works so well, insofar as determining meaning from a past event, is because we have the distance of time to determine, to kind of look for patterns, to kind of give us a starting point. Whereas right now, in my own life, I'm still in the moment, so it's hard to pick out what seems like it might be an important pattern now might not actually be, in the grand scheme of history, that significant. An example here would be, a really quick example would be Mary Todd Lincoln, the piece we saw earlier, the example, so this is actually a piece from a numerological historiograph of Mary Todd Lincoln's life, and the number 4 doesn't seem like it's that significant of a number in relation to Mary Todd Lincoln until you look at her entire life and you notice like the number of loved ones that she lost, the number of family members that she lost in the Civil War, and so it kind of pops up all throughout her life. But if you look at it in her mid-20s, say where I am, it doesn't seem that significant. But yeah, so no, I don't know. Any other questions? Everyone get more cake if you want it. We have a clipboard to leave your email address if you want more information, either about the North American Pseudo-Historical Society, or the Order of the Fabulous, or Professor Carl Oates' podcast. So it should be going live. Available streaming soon?
Yes, we're working very much diligently on it.
Okay.
Yes.
Thank you all for coming. Thank you.